The night I signed the marriage contract, my hand did not shake. That surprised even me. Everyone in that room believed I was a grieving woman settling for an old man's fortune out of desperation. None of them knew I had already read every clause twice, that I understood exactly what that signature would hand me, and that in less than a year, I would be the one deciding whether the family sitting across from me kept their names, their homes, or their freedom. But to understand how a 28-year-old woman ends up marrying her ex-fiancé's 91-year-old grandfather, you need to go back to the morning I still believed I was marrying the love of my life. Stay with me, because nothing about this story goes the way it looks in the first 10 minutes, and the biggest twist isn't even the one you're expecting right now. My name is Odessa Hartley, and 18 months ago, I thought my life was finally falling into place. I worked as a corporate attorney in Charleston, the kind of job that ate weekends and swallowed vacations whole, but I didn't mind because I had built it from nothing. My mother died when I was 19, a slow illness that taught me early how quickly a life can rearrange itself without warning. My father remarried 2 years later to a woman named Ingrid, a former event planner with a talent for smiling at exactly the right moment in front of exactly the right people. I never loved her, but I tolerated her because my father seemed happy and because I had learned early that peace is worth more than being right. I had no idea, yet, how expensive that particular lesson would eventually become. Then there was Julian. Julian Ashcombe was everything I thought I wanted. Charming without trying too hard. Ambitious in a way that matched my own drive. We met at a fundraising gala 3 years earlier, both of us reaching for the same glass of wine at a crowded bar, both of us laughing about it in a way that felt effortless. Within 8 months, he had a ring ready and a speech memorized that made half the room cry. His family was old money, the kind that owned half a shipping port and never had to explain where it came from. His grandfather, Cornelius Ashcombe, was the patriarch, a man the tabloids called reclusive and the business papers called ruthless. I met Cornelius exactly twice before the wedding planning began, and both times, he watched me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Not disapproval. Something closer to calculation, as if he were reading a contract before deciding whether to sign it. I should have paid more attention to that look. I didn't, because I was busy planning centerpieces and seating charts, blissfully unaware that the man measuring me up that carefully already suspected something about his own family that I hadn't even considered yet. 3 months before the wedding, small things started shifting, the way a house settles before you notice the crack in the ceiling. Julian's texts arrived later. His excuses for missed dinners multiplied. My stepmother, Ingrid, suddenly had urgent errands that always seemed to overlap with evenings Julian claimed he was working late. There was a night I almost caught it early. Julian came home smelling faintly of a perfume I'd known, and when I asked, he laughed it off, said a colleague had hugged him goodbye at a work dinner. I remember believing him instantly, almost eagerly, because doubting him felt like more work than I had energy for that week. I told myself I was imagining a pattern where there wasn't one, because the alternative felt too absurd to consider. My fiancé and my stepmother. It sounded like the plot of something trashy, something that happened to other people, not to a woman who read contracts for a living and prided herself on noticing the fine print everyone else missed. Here's the detail that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. The affair had already been going on for 4 months by the time I noticed anything, and it took one overlooked calendar sync. Julian's assistant had accidentally added me to a shared scheduling app meant only for his family, to crack it all open. A dinner reservation. 2 names. Neither of them mine. I stared at that entry for almost 10 minutes before I even let myself consider what it meant, scrolling backward through weeks of entries I'd never had access to before, watching a second, hidden version of Julian's calendar unfold in front of me like a photograph developing in real time. I didn't confront him immediately. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect the version of this story where the wronged woman screams in a restaurant and throws a drink. That's not what happened. Instead, I did something colder. I watched. I compared timestamps. I pulled up old photos from family gatherings and noticed things I had explained away before. The way Ingrid's hand lingered on Julian's arm a beat too long. The way Julian avoided sitting beside her at dinners as if overcorrecting for something. The way my father always seemed to be the last one to arrive at those same gatherings, conveniently delayed by traffic or work. Once you know what you're looking for, the evidence stops hiding. It was always there. I simply hadn't wanted to see it. A week before I found that calendar entry, we'd all had dinner together at my father's house, the kind of ordinary Sunday gathering I'd sat through 100 times without a second thought. Looking back now, I can replay that entire evening frame by frame and see everything I missed in real time. Ingrid refilled Julian's wine glass before he'd even asked. Julian complimented a dish Ingrid had made, using the exact phrase he once used for something I'd cooked for him months earlier, as if he were reciting lines from a script he hadn't bothered to update. My father talked cheerfully about golf and the stock market, utterly unaware that the two people closest to him at that table were quietly building a life together behind his back. I remember feeling, at the time, a small flicker of unease I couldn't name, the kind of feeling you brush aside because naming it feels dramatic. I wish I had trusted that flicker sooner. It would have saved me nothing, but it might have prepared me. 2 weeks before the wedding, I followed Julian to a private members club downtown, told the valet I was meeting my fiancé for a surprise, and walked straight into a private dining room where Ingrid sat across from him, her hand resting on his wrist, her wedding ring, my father's ring, still on her finger. The room smelled like candle wax and expensive wine, soft jazz playing low enough that I could hear every word clearly from the doorway. Neither of them saw me at first. I stood in that doorway for almost 30 full seconds, long enough to hear Julian say the words that changed everything. Once the wedding happens, it'll be easier. Odessa won't ask questions once she's family. She never does. That single sentence told me more than 4 months of secret dinners ever could. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was a plan, and I was the unwitting centerpiece of it. I still don't know exactly what easier was supposed to mean in that moment, and that unanswered question would end up mattering more than I could have guessed that night. I left without saying a word, not out of cowardice, but because I needed time to think before I reacted, and because some instinct told me that the moment I revealed what I knew, I would lose the only advantage I had left, the element of surprise. I drove home with the radio off, replaying that sentence over and over, trying to understand what version of family Julian meant, and what exactly he thought he'd be free to do once he had it. That night, sitting alone in my apartment with the wedding invitation still stacked on my kitchen counter, I did something that surprised even me. I didn't cry, not really. I opened my laptop and started researching the Ashcombe family's corporate structure, the same way I would prepare for any case at work. And that's when I found the detail that would change the entire direction of my life. Cornelius Ashcombe, Julian's grandfather, had structured nearly the entire family fortune, the shipping company, the real estate holdings, 3 subsidiary trusts, under a clause requiring his personal, direct control until his death or voluntary transfer. Julian's father had access to income, but not authority. Julian himself had access to nothing at all until Cornelius chose to hand it over. Every rumor I had heard about the family's wealth being old money passed down for generations was, functionally, a lie. It all still belonged to one man. One very old, very sharp, very lonely man who had buried 2 wives and outlived most of his friends. The plan Julian had whispered in that private dining room suddenly made a different kind of sense. Marrying me wasn't about love. It was about proximity. My legal background, my reputation, my ability to manage complicated family trusts. Julian needed a wife who could eventually help untangle Cornelius's estate in his favor, someone respectable enough that no one would question the maneuvering. And once that use had run its course, Ingrid was clearly meant to be the reward waiting on the other side. I sat with that realization for 3 days before I did anything. On the second night, my phone lit up with a text from Julian, cheerful and ordinary, asking what colors we'd settled on for the reception flowers. I remember staring at that message for a long time, feeling something harden in my chest that hadn't been there before. And on the 4th day, I called Cornelius Ashcombe directly and asked if I could speak with him alone. I need to pause here because this is the part of the story most people can't quite believe, and I understand why. When I sat across from Cornelius in his study 2 days later, I didn't come to warn him out of loyalty to a family that had just betrayed me. I came because I had already made a decision the moment I heard those words in that dining room, and I needed to know if the man in front of me was as sharp as everyone said, because what I was about to propose only worked if he was. Cornelius listened without interrupting as I laid out everything. The calendar sync. The private dinner. The exact sentence Julian had said. I watched his face the entire time, waiting for shock, for denial, for the kind of wounded pride men that age often carry. Instead, he simply nodded once, slowly, like a man confirming a suspicion he'd carried for longer than I realized. I've watched my grandson for 30 years, he said finally, his voice quieter than I expected. I know exactly what he's capable of. I just didn't know he'd found a way to use my own family to do it. That was the moment the conversation shifted from confession to negotiation, and it's the moment that determined everything that came after. Cornelius told me something that night I hadn't found in any of my research, because it wasn't public. His health had declined faster than the family knew. He had perhaps a year, maybe 2, and he had spent the last several months quietly trying to determine which of his relatives, if any, deserved control of what he'd spent 60 years building. Julian's father was passive, content to collect dividends and avoid responsibility. Julian's mother had already checked out of family matters years earlier. And Julian himself, the one person actively campaigning for trust, had just been exposed, in Cornelius's own study, as someone willing to use an unsuspecting fiancé as a stepping stone. I need someone with a spine to run this family when I'm gone, Cornelius said. Someone who understands contracts, understands people, and isn't afraid to make an unpopular decision. I've watched you for months, Odessa. I chose Julian's fiancé long before Julian chose you. That sentence still sits strangely in my memory because it meant Cornelius had been evaluating me the entire engagement, quietly, the way I evaluate opposing counsel before a negotiation. He hadn't approved of me as a granddaughter-in-law. He'd been auditioning me for something else entirely, without either of us realizing it at the time. What he proposed that night sounds outrageous on paper, and I told him as much. He wanted to marry me himself. Not for companionship, not even really for appearances, but as a legal mechanism, a nuptial agreement structured so precisely that it would grant me standing as matriarch of the family trust upon his death, superseding Julian's claim entirely and locking Ingrid and my father's remarriage out of any financial reach they might have hoped to gain by association. It was cold. It was strategic. It was, in its own strange way, the most honest proposal anyone in that family had made me in 3 years. I told him I needed time to think, and he gave me exactly 1 week, which felt like both an eternity and no time at all. That week wasn't quiet. Cornelius's longtime estate attorney, a sharp, tightly wound man named Reginald Voss, made it clear from our very first meeting that he opposed the arrangement entirely. He'd worked for the family for over 20 years, and he saw me the way I suspected most of the family would soon see me too, as an opportunist who had somehow talked her way into the will of a dying man. He tried, more than once, to convince Cornelius to reconsider, warning him that a young outsider marrying into the family this way would invite exactly the kind of scandal and legal challenge that could unravel everything he'd built. I understood his caution. I even respected it. But Cornelius had already made peace with the risk, and Voss's resistance only made me more careful about documenting every conversation from that point forward, a decision that would matter far more than I realized at the time. There was a moment, halfway through that week, when I almost walked away from the entire arrangement. Voss requested a private meeting with me, without Cornelius present, and laid out in blunt, clinical terms exactly how the public would perceive this marriage. A young attorney marrying a man in his 90s, weeks after breaking an engagement with his grandson. He didn't raise his voice, but he didn't need to. Every word was designed to make me picture the headlines, the whispers at the courthouse, the quiet judgment of colleagues who had known me as careful and composed for years. I left that meeting and sat in my car for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself drive home. But somewhere in that 20 minutes, I remembered the sound of Julian's voice in that private dining room, so certain that I would simply accept whatever was handed to me, and I realized that the version of myself Voss was trying to protect no longer existed. She'd disappeared the moment I heard those words through that doorway. My own career didn't survive the decision unscathed. either, and I want to be honest about that cost because this story isn't as clean as simply winning. My firm quietly distanced itself from me within weeks of the wedding announcement, citing concerns about conflicts of interest that everyone understood were really about optics. Partners who had mentored me for years stopped returning my calls. Clients I'd worked with for a decade sent polite, carefully worded emails wishing me well while making it clear they'd be working with someone else going forward. I won't pretend that didn't hurt. I had built that career with the same discipline I later poured into untangling the Ashcombe Trust and watching it quietly dissolve because of a decision no one outside that private dining room could ever fully understand was its own kind of grief. I want to be clear about something because I think it's important. I did not fall in love with Cornelius Ashcombe, and neither of us pretended otherwise. What grew between us over that week of quiet, careful conversations was something else. A mutual recognition. He saw in me the discipline his own descendants lacked. I saw in him a chance to take back control of a story that had been written for me by people who assumed I'd never read the fine print. During that week, I also learned something Cornelius hadn't planned to tell me, something that came out almost by accident during one of our late conversations in his study. Ingrid wasn't simply having an affair with Julian for romantic reasons. She had approached him first, 8 months earlier, with a proposition eerily similar to the one Cornelius had just offered me, except hers was built on manipulation instead of honesty. Ingrid had discovered, through my father's financial advisor, that the Ashcombe family trust was worth several times what public records suggested, and she'd spent months quietly positioning herself to benefit from it through Julian, using my engagement as cover the entire time. That detail rearranged everything I thought I understood about my own family. My stepmother hadn't stumbled into betrayal. She had engineered it, patiently, the same way I now plan to engineer my own response. 1 week later, I called Cornelius and told him yes. We were married in a small private ceremony 3 weeks after that, with only his personal attorney and 2 witnesses present. No family. No announcement beforehand. Julian found out the same way everyone else did, through a formal notification from the family's legal office informing him that the marital and inheritance status of Cornelius Ashcombe had changed, effective immediately, and that all prior discussions regarding trust succession were now void pending review by the new legal spouse. I still think about the first time Julian called me after that notice went out. His voice cracked between disbelief and rage, cycling through every emotion except the one thing he never once offered: an apology. He accused me of manipulating a vulnerable old man. He accused me of gold digging, which struck me as almost funny, considering the conversation I'd overheard in that private dining room weeks earlier. He demanded to know how I could do this to the family, as if I hadn't spent 3 years quietly becoming part of it, only to discover I was never meant to be anything more than a useful placeholder. I let him finish. Then I told him the one thing I knew would hurt more than any accusation I could throw back. I told him I knew exactly what he'd said in that private room, word for word, and that Cornelius had heard the recap directly from me before anyone else in the family knew a thing. The silence on the other end of that call told me everything I needed to know about how thoroughly his plan had collapsed. Ingrid's reaction, when it came a few days later, was somehow worse. She showed up at the estate unannounced, demanding to speak with me, insisting this was some kind of misunderstanding, that she'd only ever been supporting Julian through a difficult time. When I calmly repeated the timeline back to her, the calendar sync, the dinner reservations, the months of quiet positioning she thought no one had noticed, she stopped pretending. Her voice shifted from wounded innocence to something sharper, almost desperate, as she accused me of destroying her chance at the life she deserved. "You were never supposed to find out," she said, and I remember thinking how strange it was to hear someone admit that so plainly, as if the plan's success had always depended entirely on my ignorance. "I know," I told her. "That was your first mistake." Ingrid didn't stop there, though I didn't expect her to. A month after the wedding, she attempted a different approach entirely, reaching out to a local society columnist with a version of events that painted me as a calculating young woman who had preyed on a grieving, vulnerable old man for his fortune, conveniently leaving out her own role in the story that had led me there in the first place. The article ran for exactly 1 news cycle before Cornelius, of all people, issued a short, unambiguous statement to the same publication confirming the marriage had been his idea, his proposal, and his decision, made with full clarity and no small amount of relief at finally having someone in the family he could trust. The retraction that followed was quiet, but it was enough. Ingrid never tried the media again after that. The months that followed were not simple, and I won't pretend the transition into that family was smooth. Cornelius's adult children, Julian's father and his siblings, treated me with a mixture of suspicion and thinly veiled hostility. Board meetings became tense negotiations where every decision I made was scrutinized as either genuine leadership or opportunistic theft. Reginald Voss, still bitter over being overruled, quietly fed information to Julian's father about every move I made, hoping to build a case that I was mismanaging the trust before I'd even had a chance to prove otherwise. I understood their doubt. From the outside, I looked exactly like what Julian had accused me of being. It took real work, real late nights reviewing decades of financial records, real uncomfortable conversations, to prove that I hadn't married into that family for a payout. I'd married into it to protect what remained of it from the people already trying to hollow it out from within. 6 months into the marriage, Cornelius's health took a sharper decline, and that's when the real test began. With his ability to attend board meetings limited, the day-to-day authority over the trust shifted, exactly as the marriage contract specified, into my hands. I hadn't been running the company for even a full month when a competing shipping conglomerate, one that had circled the Ashcombe ports for years waiting for exactly this kind of transition, quietly began buying up minority shares through a chain of shell companies, hoping to force a vote before I understood the board well enough to stop them. I recognized the pattern almost by accident, late one night comparing shareholder filings against a list of names I remembered from a case years earlier at my old firm. It took 3 sleepless weeks, a dozen closed-door meetings with board members who still weren't sure whether to trust me, and one carefully worded public statement reminding the market exactly who controlled the family's founding shares, before the takeover attempt quietly folded. It was the first time the board watched me work a real crisis instead of simply managing paperwork, and something in the room shifted after that. The suspicion didn't disappear, but it softened into something closer to reluctant respect. That's also when Julian made his final move, one I'd honestly been expecting since the week we married. He attempted to file a legal challenge, claiming Cornelius lacked the mental capacity to enter into the marriage in the first place, hoping to void the entire arrangement and reclaim his position as heir apparent. Voss, despite his earlier objections to the marriage itself, refused to help build that particular case once Julian asked him directly, a small, unexpected loyalty that told me the old attorney's caution had never been about greed. Julian found another lawyer willing to take the case instead, one with far less to lose. It was, in some ways, the most dangerous moment of the entire ordeal, because if that challenge succeeded, everything I'd built over those 6 months would collapse instantly, and Julian would walk away with exactly what he'd wanted from the very beginning. But Julian had underestimated one thing, the same thing he'd underestimated about me for 3 straight years. He assumed I'd walk into that courtroom unprepared, the same way he'd assumed I'd walk down the aisle without ever finding out about Ingrid. I hadn't spent 6 months simply managing trust paperwork. I'd spent it documenting everything, session by session, conversation by conversation, video recordings of every discussion Cornelius and I had about the marriage and the trust, taken with his full knowledge and consent, each one showing a man of complete clarity discussing complex financial structures with total command of every detail. I'd had 2 independent psychiatric evaluations conducted in the weeks surrounding the wedding, both confirming full mental competency, both filed quietly with the family's legal counsel before Julian ever thought to challenge anything. The morning of the hearing, I sat in the courtroom hallway across from Julian for nearly 10 minutes before either of us said a word. He looked thinner than I remembered. The confidence that once felt so effortless now stretched tight across his face like something borrowed. When he finally spoke, it wasn't an apology. It was a warning, quiet and almost pleading, that I didn't understand what I was about to do to the family. I told him I understood perfectly. I simply wasn't willing to protect people who had never once tried to protect me. When Julian's attorney played his opening argument, I watched his confidence falter within the first 10 minutes because he had built his entire case on an assumption that had never been true. He painted a picture of a lonely, declining old man, isolated from his family, manipulated by an ambitious young attorney who had conveniently discovered the trust's true value within weeks of her own engagement collapsing. It was a compelling story, right up until my legal team began presenting evidence instead of narrative. The first recording alone undid most of his argument. Cornelius, sharp and precise, walking through amendment after amendment to the trust with a clarity that startled even the judge. His attorney tried to argue the recordings had been selectively edited, a claim that collapsed the moment my team produced the full, unedited footage along with timestamps verified by an independent forensic technician. By the time my legal team presented the psychiatric evaluations and the financial trail showing Julian's own months of quiet maneuvering before the wedding, the judge didn't need long to reach a decision. The challenge was dismissed, and more damaging for Julian, the court records from that hearing were now permanent, public, and impossible to spin. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't quite, because 2 weeks after the ruling, I received a call I never expected from Julian's own mother, a woman who had barely spoken to me since the wedding. She asked to meet privately, away from the rest of the family, and what she told me changed the way I understood this entire story one final time. She told me Julian's plan hadn't started with Ingrid at all. It had started over a year before that, when Julian first realized his grandfather intended to bypass him for someone with a stronger head for business. Rather than earning that trust honestly, Julian had decided the fastest path back into his grandfather's favor was marrying someone with exactly the professional skill set Cornelius valued, someone who could manage the empire on his behalf, while he quietly consolidated control behind the scenes. I hadn't been chosen out of love. I'd been chosen because my resume matched a gap in his plan. Ingrid had simply been the reward he arranged for himself once that plan no longer required my ignorance. Hearing that laid out so plainly should have devastated me all over again. Instead, it did the opposite. It confirmed that every decision I'd made since that night in the private dining room had been the right one. I hadn't overreacted. I hadn't been paranoid or cold or calculating beyond reason. I had simply refused to be the only person in that story who didn't know what game was being played. Cornelius passed away 14 months after our wedding, peacefully, in his sleep, with a trust structure exactly as we'd finalized it together. In the weeks before he passed, he told me something I still carry with me, sitting in the low evening light of his study, with a cup of tea neither of us finished. He said the greatest mistake of his life had been waiting so long to hand his family real responsibility instead of simply money, and that watching me take hold of both in less than a year had given him more peace than anything his own children had managed in decades. It wasn't romantic, but it was the closest thing to gratitude I'd ever received from anyone in that family, and it meant more than I expected. The family's holdings, the shipping company, the real estate portfolio, all of it now sat under my direct authority as matriarch, with clear provisions ensuring Julian's father retained a respectable role, Julian's siblings kept their independence, and Julian himself received the minimum the original trust required, nothing more. Reginald Voss, to my quiet surprise, asked to stay on as counsel under the new structure, and I agreed, because a man who refused to help dismantle his employer's family, even one he doubted from the very beginning, was exactly the kind of loyalty worth keeping close. The first board meeting I chaired after Cornelius's funeral was, in its own quiet way, the moment I finally understood how far I'd come from the woman who once stood frozen in the doorway of that private dining room. Julian's father sat at the far end of the table, still visibly uncertain whether to treat me as family or as a threat. Julian's younger sister, who had said almost nothing to me in over a year, asked afterward if she could shadow me for a few months to learn how the shipping contracts actually worked, a request that told me some bridges in that family were still worth building. I said yes. Not because I owed her anything, but because the version of leadership I wanted to build looked nothing like the one Julian had tried to secure through deception. I wanted people at that table who'd earned their seats honestly, even if it meant giving someone a second chance that Julian himself had long since burned through. Julian never got what he wanted. Ingrid never got what she'd engineered 8 months of quiet betrayal to secure. My father, who I later learned had known nothing about Ingrid's scheming, eventually filed for divorce once the full picture became public, and for the first time in years, he called me not to ask for anything, but simply to say he was proud of how I'd handled something that should have broken me. I saw Julian one final time, almost a year after the ruling, at a charity gala neither of us had realized the other would attend. He looked older, quieter. The polish that once made him so effortless to love now dulled around the edges. He asked, almost gently, if I ever thought about what might have happened if he'd simply told me the truth from the beginning, instead of building an entire plan around my ignorance. I told him honestly that I had wondered the same thing, more than once, in the quiet months after Cornelius passed. But wondering wasn't the same as regretting, and somewhere between the private dining room and the courtroom, I had stopped needing an answer to that particular question. He nodded, said very little else, and that was the last real conversation we ever had. As for my own life beyond the boardroom, it took nearly 2 years before I let anyone new get close, and even then, it happened quietly, the way most important things in my life seem to. His name was Marcus Doyle, an environmental consultant the shipping company had hired to review our port emission standards, and the first thing I noticed about him was that he asked more questions about the workers on the docks than about the size of the trust one now controlled. He never once seemed intimidated by what I'd built, and he never once tried to manage me the way Julian always had, gently steering conversations toward what he needed instead of what I wanted. Being around him reminded me what it felt like to be seen as a person again, instead of a position, a title, or a useful set of skills someone else needed to access. Sometimes, late at night, when the office building is empty and the only light on the entire floor comes from my desk lamp, I still open that old shared calendar app, the one Julian's assistant accidentally gave me access to, the one that started this entire chain of events. I never deleted it. I keep it as a kind of quiet reminder, not of the betrayal itself, but of how close I came to never finding it at all. One overlooked setting on one forgotten app, and I might have walked down that aisle exactly as planned, exactly as expected, never knowing until it was far too late to matter. I think about that private dining room often, the 30 seconds I stood in that doorway before either of them noticed me. If I had walked in and screamed, if I'd thrown the ring at Julian's feet and stormed out the way anger tells you to, none of this would have happened. I would have been the wounded ex-fiancé, a footnote in someone else's story of ambition. Instead, I became the one holding the pen when the final contract was signed. People sometimes ask if I regret marrying a man 63 years older than me, whether it was strange, whether it was purely transactional in a way that troubles them. I understand why they ask, and I never resent the question. But what Cornelius and I built together in that final year wasn't a romance, and it was never pretending to be one. It was respect, earned slowly, between two people who had both been underestimated by the family surrounding them and who recognized in each other exactly the kind of resolve that family desperately lacked. He used to say, in the last few months, that he'd spent 90 years collecting people who wanted something from him and only found one, at the very end, who simply wanted the truth. I think about that more than almost anything else he ever told me. The people who tried to write my ending for me, my fiancé, my stepmother, an entire family who assumed I'd simply accept whatever role was handed to me, never once considered that the quiet woman reading the fine print might end up holding all the leverage by the time the story was through. They wanted a wife who wouldn't ask questions. Instead, they created the one person who would ask every single one, until every secret they'd built their plans on came apart in the light. I lost the marriage I thought I wanted. I lost the version of my family I'd spent years convincing myself was whole. But I gained something none of them ever expected me to walk away with: complete control over the very empire they'd all been quietly circling, and the quiet certainty that no one would ever again mistake my patience for weakness.